You're listening to the Plastic Ship Podcast. Welcome to the Plastic Ship Podcast. I'm Madhav Malhotra, one of the students at the Plastic Ship, and I'm reaching out to several experts working to solve issues with plastic pollution. This podcast showcases unique perspectives on this massive problem to identify what its most important aspects are. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by Dr. Amy Uhrin, Chief Scientist at the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Marine Debris Program, or the MDP for short. She has decades of experience studying the ecology of marine ecosystems and now manages the MDP's research plan. I'm very excited to learn more from her about how the government can solve plastic pollution. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited to learn more about the unique perspective of how the government interacts with this problem. And before we got started with some of the areas we're talking about today, I'd really just love to hear a little bit about yourself, some of the reasons why you got started in this area of work, and what you've been up to in all of the decades you've been at it.
Okay. So actually, I'm going to step back a little bit. So I work for the NOAA Marine Debris Program, but prior to joining the program, I was a research ecologist in NOAA, a field ecologist, known for my work on disturbance dynamics and restoration in seagrass landscapes. So I'm a marine botanist by education and by trade, if you will, but I also worked on some marine debris issues, particularly the prevalence and impacts of derelict fishing gear in marine and coastal habitats. So I did a lot of work in the Florida Keys, looking at the distribution and abundance of derelict lobster traps down there and some of the impacts they can have on submerged habitats, specifically seagrass. So the derelict fishing gear is sort of my segue or my crossover into marine debris. And so now I've served as the chief scientist for the Marine Debris Program for over 5 years. And in this role, I am responsible for developing and implementing our program's strategic research plan. I oversee our diverse research portfolio, and I lead internal research projects as well as oversee external research projects that our program funds. So I've also served on several national and international expert working groups about plastic pollution, and I'm regularly asked to provide scientific input and support to a number of national and international agencies and intergovernmental organizations. So, initially in the marine science world, I was more of a coastal ecologist, if you will. So this was a different trajectory for me. So I came to the program in 2015, and now I've become more of a science manager than a science doer, if you will. Our program is a funding and coordination program, so we do not have an analytical lab, or we don't have a lot of strong field capabilities either. So the work that we are able to do is through funding partners. So it's a lot of collaborative working together. And I can talk a little bit about the program itself, because I think a lot of folks, even here in the United States, even who work on marine debris, sometimes are not entirely sure what our program does. So the NOAA Marine Debris Program was instituted by the Marine Debris Act of 2006. And this act has subsequently been amended and then amended and reauthorized again. So in 2018, the Save Our Seas Act amended and reauthorized the original act. And also you might be aware that there's a second version of the Save Our Seas Act that was introduced to Congress last June, but it's still in committee. It hasn't been passed yet. It's just a draft bill. So taken together, all of these acts mandate several activities that the Marine Debris Program is to engage in. And some things that are specifically called out are national and regional coordination, community outreach and education, response to severe marine debris events, and most commonly known is the administration of grants for marine debris projects that focus on prevention, removal, and research. So as I mentioned, we're more of a funding and coordination program. And so we achieve our research priorities and goals through cooperative agreements, partnerships, and collaborations. We have a modest staff of 24 people, and this includes our director and our deputy director, And then we have a small communications team, a science team, and an emergency response team. And then we have a couple of staff that manage our grants and our domestic and international partnerships. And all of those individuals are located at our headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is just outside DC. And then the remainder of our staff serve as regional coordinators. So they're positioned across the country to support local marine debris initiatives through coordination in 10 different regions, including the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean. And these regional coordinators guide action planning, and they provide expertise to ensure that our stakeholders in those regions have the best information available, and also so that we back in headquarters can know what's going on in the different regions across the country.
I think it's really incredible to hear about these different efforts and the small but dedicated group of people behind that. And I think where I might get started is to learn a little bit more about having this kind of responsibility and being able to integrate your efforts with a bunch of different initiatives all across the country. What are some of the ways that you try to prioritize the areas where you decide to fund, maybe the areas where you think more education is needed, and act on a continual response to how the science is changing, how our understanding of this problem is changing?
Right. So in terms of research priority setting, so this would be deciding on what are those avenues that we would like our grant competitions to focus on. And then in years where we don't have a competition, we are still able to fund research in a small capacity. But our science team, which is myself and one other person, so we have myself, the chief scientist, and a research coordinator. So like you mentioned, we try to keep tabs on the large quantities of published literature that come out every day on marine debris. There's a lot. And we are looking for those trends, the gaps, the hot topics, and we just coarsely evaluate over the year what the state of the science is as we interpret the literature that's coming out. And then some other activities that we utilize are, as our budget and our own schedules permit, we gather information from presentations and discussions at professional conferences that we attend, and also by participating in working groups, workshops, both domestic and international when we're invited and if the budget and our time allows. So having those sorts of discussions in a smaller professional setting. I mentioned our regional coordinator structure. So we also look to our regional coordinators to keep us informed of activities in their respective regions. And we also consult any research-specific actions that come out of regional action plans. So not all of the regions have focus on research as its own entity, but some of them do, and they actually have goals for research in their region. And so we do consult those and think about those. But then as a government agency, we also have to consider our own program's strategic plan and also the strategic plan of our parent office. So we sit under the Office of Response and Restoration, and this office is largely known as the oil spill people. So they're the ones that respond to, assess, and conduct natural resource damage assessment for oil spills and chemical spills. So we have to think about how we can synergize and collaborate across our office as well, because there are two other divisions. So there's a lot that goes into research priority setting and strategic planning, if you will. But that's kind of the main ways that we go about it. But if you want to think about long-term strategic planning, so we actually are in the process of finalizing our next 5-year strategic plan, which includes goals for prevention, removal, emergency response, research, and coordination. So I obviously head up the research goal team. And so it's myself and my regional coordinator, but then we bring in other staff members who have science backgrounds and want to contribute to sort of this long-term planning for research. And so our smaller science team advises that larger goal team in terms of what we think are the most pressing research issues at the moment. And then we just have a larger discussion together in terms of teasing apart the nuances of how we wish to frame our priorities in any given year. And so this interview is really great timing, as our research grant competition was just announced on September 15th for fiscal year 2021. So this competition occurs in odd years. But as I mentioned in other years, we are also able to fund research through different mechanisms like NOAA Cooperative Institutes, NOAA Broad Agency Agreements, and also competitive and non-competitive contracts. So anyone who is interested in our research grant competition for 2021, they can go to our website, which is marinedebris.noaa.gov.
And I guess to think about this mechanism that you have in being able to kind of really direct how people are working together, the topics that come out of academia, because a big part of what concerns a lot of researchers is funding, and in being able to have a little bit of direction in that, I'd say that you have a fair amount of ability to think about what happens next and really address the fundamental problems you see in the gaps in research, especially. How do you think about some of the ways in making sure that people are able to not only research these issues, but also think about your priorities as a government agency to make sure that this research eventually is translated into application and can benefit NOAA as a whole, can benefit the US government and people in general?
Mm-hmm. So for this will be, since I came on board, this will be our third research grant competition. And so in all of these competitions, a criteria is that applicants have to document a sustained engagement with resource managers at all phases of the project to ensure that real management needs are being addressed and also that the results can be applied. So that they're not doing science for science sake, that they've actually interacted with the people who might be using their data or have a real need for something very specific, and to just make sure that there's someone at the end of the pipe who's going to take that and hopefully be able to use it in a meaningful way. Now, in terms of just making sure that our research projects are accessible, we are a U.S. federal agency. So any project that is funded by the government, the data collected has to be publicly accessible. And so no exception for the Marine Debris Program, we have to do the same thing. And so once projects are completed, the data is logged into the Marine Debris Information Clearinghouse. So this is an online database that allows the interested stakeholders to find our projects and the associated results based on different search terms like location, project type, funding year, et cetera. And that's not just for research, that is for any project that has been funded through our competitive process. I might have mentioned we have grants for removal projects and prevention projects, so they all go into this clearinghouse. Something else is that specific to research, so any publication, scientific publication that comes out of a research project that we have funded has to be entered into the NOAA Institutional Repository. So that's a digital library of scientific literature from projects that have been funded by government programs, and that is also publicly accessible. And then we also have a citizen science piece to our program. So we've developed what is called the Marine Debris Monitoring and Assessment Project. So this is a citizen science initiative that engages partner organizations and volunteers across the U.S. in completing shoreline marine debris surveys using a protocol that was developed in our program. And so I think this is a nice way to get regular people, if you will, involved in tracking and monitoring marine debris and making them aware of the issue and making the issue a little bit more accessible to them and more relevant to them. And this data is also housed in a publicly accessible database. And in fact, recently, data collected as part of the Marine Debris Monitoring and Assessment Project has been used in some scientific publications, specifically one that looked at the correlation between packing bands. Like sometimes when you buy cardboard boxes and they're like flattened, but they're stacked up and there's this big plastic band around it. That's what I'm talking about. So when those end up in the environment and they haven't been broken, so there's still a circular loop, they can entangle marine fauna. And so this study used our data to look at the correlation between the abundance of packing bands on the shoreline and the entanglement rates of sea lions in the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. So that was really interesting. And the data from our monitoring project has also been used to look at the effectiveness of plastic bag bans and smoking bans in Maui County, Hawaii. And there was another study that used our data to look at some socioeconomic factors that might contribute to patterns of marine debris on beaches. So that's a really nice initiative where the data is publicly accessible and anyone can request an account and download the data and use it for any type of analyses or projects like the one I just mentioned.
Do you think there are any large barriers that they prevent nonprofits, businesses, or other governmental agencies, etc., from being able to access what is being produced by the research that you're funding, but also just academic research in general in the topic of marine debris?
Well, I think there's been a shift in the last, 5 to 10 years in that scientific publications in journals, the journals are requiring a data accessibility statement, and some journals are requiring that data has to be publicly accessible. So I think we're starting to see a shift to making that data more available for folks who might be interested in exploring further on their own. But I think one of the biggest challenges comes down to just awareness and communication. And we see this actually within the federal family, within our own agency, but providing opportunities for learning about what everybody is doing with regard to marine debris, plastic pollution, whatever the subject might be. So, for example, last year, the NOAA Marine Debris Program, we hosted a webinar. It was internal to other NOAA researchers, other NOAA programs, but giving them the opportunity to talk about what their interests and capabilities are with respect to marine debris research. So what toys do they have, if you will? What does their fleet look like? What analytical equipment do they have? What are they working on with respect to marine debris? So that's a form of internal communication within an agency, right? And then also the NOAA Marine Debris Program, we chair the Interagency Marine Debris Coordination Committee. So this is a committee that brings together representatives from other federal agencies, and they meet to share information and assess and promote best management practices and basically coordinate the federal government's efforts to address marine debris. So that's a form of cross-agency communication within the federal system. And later this month and into October, 4 of our research projects that we funded in 2017, they're wrapping up at the end of this year. And so we've asked each of the principal investigators to give presentations as part of our One NOAA Science Seminar series. And that's also open to the public. So this is a great opportunity for anyone, members of academia, nonprofits, industry, and others to learn about the research projects that we have supported in the past and what are some of the results coming out of those. So we make sure also that we post all of this information on our website, which I gave you earlier. So we post seminar announcements, our grant announcements on our website, but also we take advantage of, I don't know if you've heard of the Marine Debris Listserv. This is a listserv that's administered by a group called OCTO, which stands for Open Communications for the Ocean. So I think it's technically called marinedebris.info, but it is a listserv. And so whenever we have a grant announcement or seminar announcement, we also make sure that it gets onto the Marine Debris Listserv, because it's an international listserv and it gets a lot of traffic.
It's really great that you're trying to do this beyond just the, responsibilities of keeping track of all of the funding, all of the changes, and then taking the initiative to go beyond that and try to engage in this outreach. And this kind of brings me in terms of challenges. It wouldn't be a complete podcast, I guess, without talking about some of the common perceptions of, say, the difficulties of doing this kind of research in the government system, especially given changing administration attitudes and the last little while with the effects of COVID, etc. So what are some of the challenges that you found in the past 5 years were a thing in terms of being a government agency and having these shifts in funding and priorities and schedules, etc.?
Right. So what we hear most from our partners and from just other researchers in the field is a lack of funding, and not necessarily from just our program specifically, but marine debris funding generally. So However, I would have to say that I believe the funding situation is getting better as more and more entities become aware of the need for additional research, like the National Science Foundation, EPA, although that's a federal agency. But there are several nonprofit foundations that have put together funding announcements. I think of Schmidt Ocean and I think of the MacArthur Foundation. And the good thing for us is that many of these funding opportunities focus on issues like waste management, recycling, plastic alternatives, circular economy, which is really nice for the NOAA Marine Debris Program because at the moment our program is not mandated to directly work on those topics. So it's nice to see that that's kind of been taken up by other entities. So certainly lack of funding all around, I hear a lot from partners in the general marine debris world. And of course, a number of our partners have expressed current challenges given restrictions that were placed on campus access, restrictions on field activities, which hampers the progress of your projects. A lot of partners working from home, which presents its own set of challenges. So certainly those are out there. But I think more generally, when you think about the biggest challenge when you're studying plastic pollution, is that we're not talking about one type of material that is produced identically every time it's made. So the term plastic is a catch-all that encompasses several different types of polymers, which are processed in different ways. They contain different additives. And what that means is when they end up in the environment, they behave differently. Some sink, some float. They break down differently. Some break down more than others. When they break down, their properties change even more. So when you try to study plastics in the environment, when you try to sample plastics in the environment, you often end up with a plastic soup, if you will, that could contain many, many ingredients that are often unidentifiable without having very expensive equipment and time-consuming analytical techniques. So I think that's really one of the biggest challenges with this issue is just the variety of types of quote-unquote plastics that are out there and how they behave differently when they're in the environment and trying to come up with how to deal with them collectively.
Then this brings me to the last area of questions I had when it comes to the future of your work in this area and also the work of different stakeholders. Like you mentioned, it's great to see different groups and organizations in the nonprofit world, etc., taking up the areas we've seen limitations in and starting to do what they can to get over these types of challenges. So finally, when it comes to the future of research regarding marine debris and the effects of plastics in our oceans, what are some of the areas you'd encourage other stakeholders to take action on to work more towards?
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest thing is recognizing, we all play a role in this issue, but also that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So as we've discovered, being federal government working on this issue, the collaborations are really important. So we work with federal, state, local governments, businesses, academia, NGOs, tribal entities. And I think just that continued collaboration and communication among those entities in terms of what are your strengths? What are your strengths? What are you working on? What are you working on? And putting together project teams that balance each other. I really think this is the true way to make some meaningful change and contribute to the solution. And in our program, in the NOAA Marine Debris Program, we tend to focus on marine debris prevention and removal. Removal, particularly from shorelines and coastal areas where it's easier to identify and pick up. And it's really the belief of our program that prevention is the key. And so the analogy that you've probably heard before is that if you're at home and the water's running in your sink and your sink is overflowing, what's the first thing you're going to do before you start cleaning up the water? Is you're going to turn the tap off. And that's kind of a nice analogy for what's going on in the marine debris world. That's how prevention works. We've got to turn off the tap so that marine debris stops flowing into the environment, into the ocean.
I think that's a great call to action to wrap up on, and I wanted to thank you for providing all of this insight and providing these resources for other researchers and stakeholders to look into.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it and appreciate your work on trying to bring this this issue to light.